Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to be reading The Elves and the Shoemaker by illustrated by Paul Galdone. This is the folk tale that we have been reading this week together. And you might remember that a folk tale is a story that is really, really old, and it started out a long time ago as a story that people told orally. That means they said it out loud. And it wasn't written down until much later, so we don't really know who invented the story, who thought of it for the first time. And one of the reasons, as we discussed, that people would tell folk tales is that they wanted to be able to teach their children lessons about how they should act, about what was good behavior and what was bad behavior, and how they should be and how they should treat other people, and to sort of impart their values and their morals onto their children. And so while we're reading the folk tale of the Elves and the Shoemaker, I want you to think about what the lesson is that you're supposed to learn from this story. What is the lesson? What is the theme? What do they want you to learn from the story? So I'm going to be reading it pretty much straight through and not pausing to ask questions while we're the way that we do when we read together. So if you need to pause the video to sort of stop and just think about something or wonder about something or write something down or ask or draw a picture of something that you really like in the story, that is totally fine. And any pictures that you draw about the Elves and the Shoemaker while we're reading it, I would really, really appreciate it if you would take a photo of those and put them up on Seesaw, because I love to see all of your cool ideas and thinking. All right, so we are now I'm going to switch the cameras, and we're going to read The Elves and the Shoemaker. The Elves and the Shoemaker by Paul Galdone. There once was a shoemaker who, through no fault of his own, became so poor that at last he had nothing left but just enough leather to make one pair of shoes. He cut out the shoes at night so he could set to work on them the next morning. Because he had a good conscience, the shoemaker laid himself down on his bed and fell asleep at once. In the morning, after he had said his prayers, the shoemaker went to his workshop. There he found the pair of shoes made and finished, and standing on his table. He was very much astonished, and could not tell what to think. He took the shoes in his hand to examine them more carefully. They were so well made that every stitch was in the right place, just as if they had come from the hand of a master workman. Soon a customer entered, and as the shoes fitted him very well, he paid more than the usual price for them. Now the shoemaker had enough money to buy leather for 2 more pairs of shoes. He cut them out at night and intended to set to work the next morning with a fresh spirit. But that was not to be, for when he got up, they were already finished. A customer soon bought them and gave the shoemaker so much money that he was able to buy enough leather for 4 more pairs. Beautiful shoes. Early the next morning, he found the 4 pairs finished also. And so it always happened. Whatever the shoemaker cut out in the evening was finished by the morning, and soon he was making a very good living. One night, not long before Christmas, when the shoemaker had finished cutting out the shoes from the leather, he turned to his wife before he went to bed and said, "How would it be if we were to stay up tonight and see who it is that does us this service?" His wife agreed and set the candle to burn. Then they both hid in a corner of the room behind some coats that were hanging up. They peeked out between the coats and began to watch. As soon as it was midnight, in came two neatly formed, naked little elves. They seated themselves on the shoemaker's table, took up the work that was already prepared, and began to stitch, pierce, and hammer the leather. The elves worked so cleverly and quickly with their little fingers that the shoemaker could scarcely follow them. So full of wonder was he. The elves never stopped until all the shoes were finished and standing ready on the table. Then they jumped up and ran off. All the shoes they made. The next morning, the shoemaker's wife said to her husband, "Those elves have made us rich, and we ought to show them how grateful we are. With all their running about and nothing to cover them, they must be very cold." She smiled. "I tell you what, I will make little shirts, coats, waistcoats, and breeches for them, and knit each of them a pair of stockings, and you shall make each of them a pair of shoes." The husband consented willingly, and that night, when everything was finished, they laid the gifts on the table instead of the cut-out leather. See all the little outfits? Then they hid themselves so that they could observe how the elves behaved when they saw their presents. At the stroke of midnight, the elves rushed in, ready to set to work. But when they found the neat little clothes made just for them, they stood a moment in surprise, and then they showed the greatest delight. Quickly they took up the pretty garments and slipped them on, singing, "What spruce and dandy boys we are, no longer cobblers we will be." They hopped and danced about, jumping over the chairs and tables, and at last they danced out the door. From that time on, the elves were never seen again, but the shoemaker and his wife prospered as long as they lived. And they have a cat. The end. So, what was the lesson that we should learn from that folk tale, Elves and the Shoemaker? Why do you think that people told this story? People from way, way long ago felt that this story was important enough to tell over and over again. What were they trying to teach their children about? What did they want their children to learn from this story? What I would like you to do is to draw a picture of the part that you think teaches the lesson. And then I want you to write and or record yourself telling what the lesson is. What do you think the lesson is? What are you supposed to learn from that story? I'm really looking forward to seeing all of your beautiful illustrations. Remember to include the characters and the setting and their actions, what they're doing at that part. You could choose any part you want that you think tells the lesson of the story. What do you think is the lesson of the story? Illustrate that part and tell why that was so important.